Good afternoon. Welcome to the Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions podcast. My name is Andrew Kremen, and joining me as my new co-host is Isabella Anderson. Isabella, welcome.
Hi, happy to be here.
It's good to have you on.
Thanks.
With the restructuring of the Chinese economy, the new security pact signed with the Solomon Islands, and grey zone conflict in the Taiwan Strait, we're heading into a decade some consider analogous with the 1930s. To discuss the economic side of this topic, we're joined by Craig Allen, President of the US-China Business Council, a private, non-partisan, non-profit organization representing over 200 American companies doing business in China. He is also the former United States Ambassador to Brunei. Craig Allen, welcome to Sunday Sessions.
Thank you so much for having me. What a pleasure.
Always. Well, thank you. What can you tell us about Chinese money diplomacy in the Pacific? Is this what led to the Solomon Islands China Security Pact?
So I think with regard to the Solomon Islands, it's probably healthy to consider our own shortcomings. In the case of the United States, we have not even had an embassy in the Solomon Islands for many, many years, despite knowing the strategic importance of the Pacific Islands and the Solomon Islands in specific. So there's a little bit of reflection on that lack of strategic foresight in Washington today. And I understand in Australia and New Zealand, Japan, there's also some reflections. So it's not surprising that the Chinese have taken advantage of opportunities that others have left not fully exploited. And indeed, from my understanding, is that the Chinese have been looking at the Solomon Islands and have had an embassy there for some time, and that trade and investment of a considerable degree has gone in to the Solomon Islands. My understanding is even that the Chinese led a Christian delegation to the Solomon Islands, which is a rather unusual chapter, perhaps, in Chinese diplomacy, at least in the post-revolutionary era. So there's also an element of Taiwan rivalry with China here. But I think that it's useful to reflect on the future. What are we going to do? How can we do a better job with regard to the Pacific Island Forum and the members of that organization to counter what is obviously very successful and aggressive Chinese initiative here. But I reflect mostly on the lack of a U.S. embassy there for so many years. How could we have allowed that to happen?
Mm-hmm. And following on from that, and the basis of geopolitics and state-to-state relationships, and also touching on Australia. So there was previously an interview where you mentioned that, quote, the trade coercion by China at that point wasn't consistent with the World Trade Organization obligations of fair trade norms.
Absolutely.
So there, of course, are reasonings behind Australia's stance over state belief and the values and the interest of Western allies within the society. So with reference to state interest in a globalized economy and incompatible state governance between states, can it truly continue to work within a globalized economy? And can international trade and integration of states continue the way it has? Or do we need to consider another approach with policy and relations?
Oh, what a wonderful question. Thank you. I regret that the globalization that was envisaged under the Bretton Woods institutions and kind of institutionalized on the economic basis by the WTO is no longer working well. Mm-hmm. And there was a moment when China joined the WTO 21 years ago when at that time the Director General of the WTO, Subachai, asked the question, can the WTO survive China's entry? And I think that if Subachai were alive today, that he would probably ask, can the WTO survive China and the United States rivalry on trade and particularly technology? And I think that he would be pessimistic about that. The formal commitments under the WTO remain, but the brazen lack of implementation and brazen violations of the WTO by both the United States and China, I think, are really regrettable, particularly for the smaller trading countries and the middle powers. So I'm pretty pessimistic about the future of the global trading system. I'm optimistic about the future of the CPTPP and hopeful that under Australia and Japanese, Canadian, Singaporean, New Zealand plays a very important role here, that you have developed a new model that will effectively police some of the problems that the multilateral system is no longer capable of working with. So I'm a huge fan of the CPTPP and hopeful that the United States will rejoin, cognizant that both Taiwan and China have applied for CPTPP membership, and curious about how that process will entail. I think that one trend that RCEP suggests might be dominant these days is regionalization rather than globalization. And I think that offers promise and also challenges. When the Chinese look at RCEP and regionalization, they look at it kind of in a manner that would be reminiscent of imperial China, with traditional trade flows within the region, and that, of course, is very uncomfortable for many of China's trading partners. So it will be interesting to see how the CPTPP members adjudicate China's application for entry into the CPTPP. In the meantime, RCEP is being implemented, at least, if not in full, in part. And I have no doubt that will drive regional regional integration. From a U.S. perspective, this creates quite a puzzle for us. American exporters are going to be held at a disadvantage from a tariff line. And will that encourage American investment within the RCEP or CPTPP region so that we're able to get over those tariff walls? And I suspect that many companies are looking at that and wondering about what the best way to manage the situation is.
Right.
There's talk that the zero COVID lockdowns in Shanghai may last until the National Party Congress in November. How do these affect the economies of China and the West?
Yeah, again, a beautiful question, and I thank you for it. I think before replying, I think that we just take a moment to recognize how difficult this is for all the people. I have colleagues who have been locked down, haven't left their apartment for 5 weeks, who are worried about food, and those who are at the lower income levels are much more worried than others. So this is really a difficult human problem, and let's spare a thought for those who are suffering now. Regarding the Chinese economy, we're seeing the investment banks and the economists revise down their figures, but in quite interesting ways. There's quite a gulf between how the analysts are looking at this. Most of the major investment banks are looking at perhaps a modest drop from the targeted 5.5% to 4.5%. But independent economists are looking at it much more with a much higher degree of skepticism, thinking that there might be a zero growth or perhaps negative growth for a couple of quarters. And let's be honest, we don't know. And we don't know because we don't know the future of the dynamic zero COVID policy. Will it be implemented stringently? Will you have millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of Chinese in lockdown? And we don't know the answer to that. So I think that we just need to look at this. Now, the question on a global basis, I think, is equally interesting. Certainly, there is a supply chain impact, but how big is it? How big will it be? So a number of companies have already revised down estimates of their growth because of COVID in China. But there's two pieces of that. There's what's happening in China. If China's a large part of their revenue, that's a piece of it. But there's also China as a supply chain center or source. And if it's only China and the ports keep running and it's just millions of Chinese are locked down, then that has a lesser overall economic impact. If this affects global supply chains, then I think that we need to begin to really think about the global impact of that, depending on how long it lasts. If one is pessimistic, one could postulate that could have an impact on consumer inflation, supply chain in industrial economies around the world. I hope it doesn't come to that. And fundamentally, the policies of the Chinese government matter a lot, but we don't know what those policies are going to be. And that uncertainty is very unsettling. Already, there was a degree of decoupling going on, particularly in the tech sector, and this has gotten a good number of supply chain specialists out to sharpen their pencils and look at alternative sources of supply. And if supply chains leave China, they might not come back, and thus it's really in China's interest to try to find the balance between public health, legitimate public concerns, and economic growth. And making that trade-off is devilishly hard. And right now, the Chinese are struggling.
Yeah, and on that, because you are an economist, so what is your opinion on that balance between policy and economics and growth? Because economics is essentially the well-being of society and people. So within the natural market process, and if policy does have to be implemented on the basis of ethics or geopolitics, for example, with the Trade One Agreement, and we saw that didn't exactly end out exactly how it was intended for. We saw that China didn't commit to what they agreed with the US to buy. So what is your suggestion on how do you balance both economics but also policy without creating a deadweight loss, as you mentioned previously with tariffs and how that's going to impact businesses? Where is that middle ground, in your opinion?
Well, vis-a-vis the ethics of epidemics, I would say that the ethical choices are impossibly hard here. Chinese ministers have said that if COVID were allowed to run rampant in China, that there could be a loss of up to 2 million lives. And so on the COVID side, I'm not smart enough to be able to make that ethical choice, and thank goodness I don't have to. I think that your question is broader, though, and the question is framed in a way that I'm going to take a little bit of objection with, if I may. I'm going to question your assumptions here, if I may. Trade and investment is a positive sum exchange between willing partners. No one forces anybody to buy anything. And indeed, trade for Australia, for China, for the United States is the most positive sum game in the world. And ethically, I think, in any case, incredibly beneficial for everyone involved. And just as an intellectual experiment here, those who are least associated with the global supply chains are absolutely suffering in absolute poverty. So that's not to answer all of the questions within trade and economics and investment. The ethical guidelines are incredibly important. I would argue that American, European, Australian investment in China has led to significant human rights advances in China. And for those of us who are old enough to remember the pre-WTO world, where there was no foreign investment, we recognize the gains that have been made, at least in terms of economic freedom, with a great deal of appreciation. So let me just double down on that and note that Australian, European, American companies are not corrupt. That's a great starting place. And that's not something that you should assume in a market like China. We pay our taxes. We are one of I think that of the top rated employers in China, 7 are American. And that's not because they're human rights violators. It's because they're great places to work. And we seek through our companies and through our values to elevate women. It's a kind of part of the job. We seek to be environmentally conscious. And indeed, I would argue in almost any industry, you'll find European, Australian, and American investors in China leading on the ESG front across the board, with Chinese companies following. And so I'm here to argue that I'm happy to address any of the ethical questions. They're important, but I'm going to argue that the multinational presence in China has benefited the Chinese people enormously, and that's a good thing. But that it's not perfect, indeed. And I'm happy to discuss any of the more complicated areas that we face, because in dealing with a governance system that's so different from the legal frameworks that we enjoy in Europe, Australia, and the United States, there's a great deal of complexity. And it's quite okay to look at that complexity and determine what's the best way to deal with these issues. So I'm happy to discuss that, but I will, my position is firm, and that is that multinational corporations' presence in China has been enormously beneficial to the Chinese people and to overall economic development and global integration. So that's my stand, and I'm going to stick with that.
Well, I may bring up one of those more difficult topics. In your testimony to the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, you mentioned that healthcare companies that are not successful in China can no longer expect to be successful global players in the long run?
Sure.
Do you believe that healthcare companies may seek to lobby for what the West may previously have held as unethical activities domestically in order to enter the Chinese market? This certainly exists in the entertainment industry.
Yeah. Let me note, I've been in this business for a long time, and I've never heard of any unethical activities that American pharma or med tech companies have employed. Now, both of those markets are complex, and there are many inefficiencies, but at least I am not aware of any ethical failings of any American companies in that area. Similarly, in entertainment, I'm going to push back. I don't know of unethical circumstances. So happy to talk about in general. I'm not going to talk about any of my companies, my members, but happy to talk in general if you would care to be more specific. Let me say that American, Australian, European companies, when they are invested in China, must follow Chinese law. And that is a fact. And American companies, when invested anywhere, must follow the law. And I think that at least heretofore, American companies have not yet been put in a position of a conflict of laws. In other words, if you follow that American law, you will ipso facto be put in a conflict with Chinese law. So I'm not saying that won't happen, but it has not happened yet. And American companies in the medtech area, in life sciences, and in entertainment have done very well in China. And I think that there is no better example, really, of the positive sum benefits of trade than life sciences in China. We have many investments in China, largely because of the talent pool is so deep, and lots of life-saving medicines and medical devices and other products flowing to China, and increasingly from China into the United States. And all of those, at least in my view, benefit those who are on the receiving end. In the life sciences industry, recently, there are more and more tensions. And I would say that those tensions are largely a result of the government of China's trying to squeeze prices to keep public healthcare expenditures at around 7% of GDP. And that's a really hard thing to do with an aging population. But from a Chinese perspective, it's a really important government objective. So this industry is becoming more complex, particularly as talent in China continues to develop. And we're seeing a lot of innovation coming out of China in this area, in genomics, in stem cell research, in small batch molecules for pharma. So the markets are definitely becoming much more competitive, and margins are down significantly. And that creates tensions within the industry, absolutely. So I don't want to run from the issue, but this is a sector that is very large, growing very rapidly, one where we've seen a great deal of liberalization. Ella mentioned previously the Phase 1 agreement, and I would say that our assessment of the Phase 1 agreement is quite positive. That while I regret the trade distortion measures element of the agreement caused by the quantitative targeting, which has probably negatively influenced Australian companies, the trade liberalization measures of the Phase 1 agreement have been quite faithfully implemented. And financial services would be the best example. But agriculture would be another example. And intellectual property rights, particularly vis-a-vis the pharma sector, would be a third example. And thus we've seen quite a significant increase in American pharma exports to China over the last 24 months. Yeah, that's something that we celebrate. We're very, very happy with. So I could understand why analysts would note or emphasize that the quantitative elements of the Phase 1 agreement didn't, that the Chinese did not live up to their commitments, and we could discuss that. But I would emphasize that the Chinese did live up to their commitments on the more standard trade policy types of issues: intellectual property rights, financial services, ag, sanitary, phytosanitary, and that the longer term results of that are certainly more important than the meeting a specific target in a specific year in a manner that kind of stinks of state managed trade, and one that I suspect disadvantaged some of China's other trading partners, including Australia. So it's complex, but the U.S. exports to Australia, to China were up 21% last year, 17% the year before, 38% increase over 2 years. That's pretty good. And many in the U.S. are quite happy with those increasing exports, increasing trade, and what, at least until COVID, had been a pretty robustly expanding Chinese economy. I think that because of COVID, all that's in question now. But China has delivered up to a third of global growth over the last 10 years. Will that be the case in the next 10 years? We'll see.
I like how you did mention just then that it's more so transformational, and we shouldn't be looking at it in a transactional type of agreement. And I do agree with that. So with the Trump administration, it came off more transactional and hitting commitments and numbers. And under the Biden administration, do you believe it's becoming more transformational in policy approach and agreements, or what would be your predictions?
Okay, that's a great question. I would say that on the overall, that there has been continuity and discontinuity between the Trump and the Biden administrations. So let me go on the continuity side first. And I would there emphasize that both the Biden and the Trump administration are quite populist. And Donald Trump was a right-wing populist, and Joe Biden is a more of a left-wing populist, but they're both populist in terms of both of them are anti-elite and anti-corporate. And both of them are rather anti-trade as well, which is an interesting bit of continuity. And just to reflect on that for a second, it's interesting that the Biden administration, during the election, candidate Biden said that the tariffs were, quote unquote, a disaster. But and within the Democratic Party platform before the election, it noted that the tariffs were detrimental. But President Biden has maintained those same tariffs, at least until today. And I think that that's why the populist framing is actually quite useful. But there have been significant changes. And the two big ones are that while Donald Trump was very transactional, Joe Biden is very much values driven, and he means it. He's what Uncle Joe tells you is what he really thinks and feels and will do. And he believes in the value of democracy and human rights, as exemplified in his Summit of Democracies. And he absolutely means it when he's talking about human rights, liberty, press freedom, women's rights, LGBTQ, and liberty. So there's an enormous emphasis on this normative, values-driven agenda. The other big thing that has changed between the Trump administration and the Biden administration is that the Biden administration very much values allies. And I think that that's really quite obvious. But it's only really this week really coming into fulfillment, if you will. So it is important that Joe Biden work closely with the EU, with Australia, with Japan, and other allies on issues like Russia and China and other issues as well. And I mentioned this week because on May 12 and 13, the president will be hosting the ASEAN leaders in Washington. And I expect that to be a very good and very important meeting to discuss Pacific issues. And also this week, on May 15, the US and EU will hold a Trade and Technology Council meeting, the second one in Paris. And actually, many of the subjects, particularly the framing vis-a-vis China, will probably be quite similar in these two meetings. And within 2 weeks, on May 24, there will be a meeting in Tokyo with certainly the Indian Prime Minister, the Japanese Prime Minister, and a Australian representative. I'm not 100% sure that will be the Prime Minister. That's your issue, not mine. But where I understand the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework might be released. And so this is not conceivable under the Trump administration. It is very much a Biden administration approach. I think AUKUS and really the enlivening of the Quad would not have been conceivable under the Trump administration. And the strengthening of NATO, both vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine, but also of importance, the fact that NATO has written in to it China as a cause of concern is a important achievement from the Biden administration perspective of working closely with allies. And so I'd say that there's really been a sea change in U.S. policy, both on the normative side and on the allies side, and both are of course connected. And at least in my view, this would probably make U.S. policy in both theaters, in both Europe and in Asia, much more sustainable and much more likely to succeed. Now, the missing element there is the economic element, which is crucially important, and perhaps something we can discuss in greater detail.
As an ambassador for the United States to Brunei, you represented not just the US government, but also the will of the US people. Did you ever find yourself at odds with the course of action of your government? How did you manage, if that was the case?
Yeah, thank you. As a ambassador, one follows orders, and one is loyal to one's president, whether or not one personally believes that the policy is a correct policy. And I certainly hope that I was a loyal servant of the president and of the American people. And Andrew, I think that you're right to differentiate that there probably is a difference sometimes between the government and the people. And for a long-term sustainable career, you gotta meld those two. You gotta moderate the frequencies between those two. And if you're not able to, then you need to resign. And upon the transition of from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, I will admit that I had faced some complexity here, and I started very early on when the United States left the Paris Climate Agreement, and in my view, that was quite shameful. I think that when the U.S. left the TPP negotiations, that was certainly very unfortunate. When we announced the steel and aluminum tariffs, what we call the 232s, that was clearly WTO illegal, in my view, and therefore not acceptable. When we moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, at least in my view, that was also violative of the UN agreements. I believe that America and all countries should meet their commitments, and I had a hard time when we did not. When our president chose not to meet our commitments. And so what do you do? On the day that Donald Trump said trade wars are good and they're easy to win, that was kind of the straw that broke my back. And so I sent in my resignation on that day, knowing that I could no longer serve him effectively and that he deserved somebody who backed him fully. And so time for me to get a fresh start.
And this will probably be my last question. So just with your own insight, the last 2 years have been very eventful, and with everything so globalized, it's impacting everyone somewhat equally. What are your predictions on the market? Are you bullish or are you bearish?
I think that we need to have a resolution of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And without a resolution of Ukraine, then I see no way to be bullish. Mm-hmm. I think that the unintended consequences of this war on hunger in many parts of the world is going to be quite profound. And that will lead to political stability and economic unrest. And indeed, we're seeing elements of that already. There's very high level of debt globally. And I don't, absent a quick resolution of Ukraine, I don't see how we avoid higher inflation and geopolitical problems around the world. I hope I'm wrong.
What do you believe Australia and the West could do to improve their dealings with China?
Forgive me. Could you repeat?
What do you believe Australia and the West could improve in their dealings with China? It's certainly an election topic. We've got one coming up in 2 weeks.
I'm not going to speak for Australia, but I think that the United States and China need to re-engage in dialogue, and having an episodic dialogue at the senior level is not sufficient. That we have many problems where the United States and China need to collaborate on the global commons, and without that collaboration, the world suffers. The United States and China need a better understanding on geopolitical issues and how to work with each other over, excuse me, over many issues. So without dialogue, I don't understand how we're going to do that. So both the United States and China and Australia are going to have a political transition in the near term. And I'm hopeful that this will be a chance to relook at the relationship and try to come out with a better modus operandi. Right now, we are in a bad place. Now, the Chinese need to play ball here, and the Chinese need to recognize that they also have obligations under the WTO and under RCEP to Australia and other trading partners, and they should reconsider their policies. Will they do so? The Chinese have proven to be very tactically flexible and capable of adjusting their policies. And we see positive and negative signs there. I would say on the positive side, in my view anyway, it is a good sign that the National People's Congress has decided to adopt the ILO protocols on forced labor. I have been recommending that for years and glad to see that they have done it. Wouldn't it be a good idea, now that they are ratified and encoded in Chinese law, to permit third-party investigations into Xinjiang and beyond, to certify whether or not there's forced labor in the global supply chain? So that's a positive step forward. There are many negative steps also that we're looking at. So within the Politburo in China and the Standing Committee of the Politburo, there's not a single way forward here. There's tension between economic growth and political control, and so we'll see where they go. It is my hope that they will decide to converge with global norms, with their WTO and RCEP and CPTPP norms. And I think that we need to work in that direction. There is a large private sector in China that agrees wholeheartedly with the CPTPP norms and values and standards. And at least from my perspective, they are a constituency that deserves a lot of respect. And so while on the political side and the economic side, there's a lot of tension there, that's for sure. But this is dynamic, and it is important. And the diplomatic negotiations that both that both the United States and Australia have with China will impact these outcomes, China's political and economic development. And we need to be engaged. We need not to kind of look at it from afar and go tisk tisk. We need to be in there on the ground, working with whomever we can within China to try to affect a better domestic policies, both on the economic and the political side. And I'm not at all suggesting that that's easy, but it's not impossible either. And to the extent that we are engaged, we may be successful. To the extent that we look from afar, especially if we look from afar with enmity, we will fail. And we have no choice. Australia is going to be there 100 years from now. The United States is going to be here 100 years from now. China's going to be 100 years from now. What's our relationship going to be? Is it going to be one where that the peoples of our three countries want, or is it going to be something much less than that? That future is in our hands.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. On that, do you think then that there should be a form of mediator as we do with the WTO? So do we assign more power to international organizations in order to implement these agreements, because there may potentially be conflicting state interest? And as you said, we need to establish a dialogue. Do we assign more power to international organizations?
So I am a huge fan of the CPTPP. I worked on it for 4 or 5 years. And I believe that the norms expressed there is exactly where we would want China to go, at least economically, right? And I get it that that's not the whole debate. That the debate is much larger than that. CPTPP is open architecture. The Chinese could begin to implement the environmental protocols, the fishing protocols tomorrow, if they wanted to. They could implement the subsidies or the government procurement regime, begin to take steps to do so. On the digital side, wouldn't it be wonderful if we saw some liberalization there that would be rhyme with or be at least more in resonant with the CPTPP? So at least in my view, the global institutions are not going to constrain either China or the U.S. Unless China and the U.S. feel that it's in their interest to do so. And within China, there is a large constituency that recognizes that joining CPTPP would be a way to extend economic growth, not at the 8% level, but they will do just fine at the 3 to 4% level. And absent the disciplines within the CPTPP, that they're not going to reach that minimum level of economic growth. So in my view, those Chinese who believe that the economic and ipso facto political reforms associated with CPTPP are worthy of our support. And whether or not the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, are able to countenance that is something that is very worthy of debate, and at least in my view, a really interesting subject to watch. And I would just put a pin on that. Don't underestimate the Chinese economic negotiators. They're good. They're really good. They're hard negotiators. But as China used their entry into the WTO to address the economic problems that they had at the turn of the century, China could use the CPTPP to address the economic problems that they have today. And I think that that is a hugely interesting subject to follow.
You've mentioned your involvement in the creation of the CPTPP. However, I'd like to ask about your other accomplishments throughout your career.
Oh, I don't really feel that I have many, but I am young, and I have a lot of innings left. And so because there's such poverty in my past in terms of achievements, I'm going to work harder and try to serve my constituencies, my friends, my family, and particularly mates in Australia better than I have in the past. And if I were able to do that, I would consider that a great achievement.
Well, in that case, what advice could you give to university students who would like to engage in business with China?
I think it's a really interesting time now in China's relationship with the world, and it's a difficult time, right? There's nothing easy about 2022. It's really hard, and so I applaud all of the students, both Australia and in the United States, who keep at it and want to work on these subjects. The thing that I would note is that there's an awful lot of ideology flying about. There is an awful lot of nationalism. It sometimes degenerates into jingoism and to xenophobia even. And at least in my country and what I see in China, racism is not unheard of. What I would say is keep empirical and use data whenever possible, and be pragmatic. When we get caught up in an ideological debate about how much better we are than they are, then we've just simply lost the plot, and it's not helpful. Rather, I think, particularly if we're able to use data, cognitive empathy is a virtue that we could all practice. And you don't have to agree with the Communist Party of China, but you do need to understand their perspective. And you have to recognize that they're not doing X, Y, or Z because they hate Americans. Rather, they're doing X, Y, and Z mostly for internal reasons. What are those internal reasons? And how does the Politburo stand on that? And what are the various relationships between the ministries? And how is this evolving over time? And how might we be able to influence it? I think are the empirical questions that we could really ask. Let us not underestimate the degree of goodwill among the Chinese people that exists for Australians and Americans. Yeah, the government relations are really, at least in the United States, icy cold. But the reservoir of goodwill is wide and deep. We need to remember that, and remember that that in the past we've had wonderful relations with the Chinese, and that we're going to have to manage this relationship for forever. And how do we do that? I think is a enormously important question, which my generation hands off to your generation with apologies, because we didn't do a good job at that. And over to you.
Thank you. That was very well said.
Well, you've been very humble, taking the time out of your day to speak with us, and from the other side of the world as well. Craig Allen, President of the US-China Business Council, thank you for taking your time to talk with us.
Thank you very much. What a pleasure and an honor, and I wish you well. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a warm and very informative interview.
Great. Yeah, I'm delighted to be associated with the university. I'll subscribe to your podcast after this one. I don't want to listen to this one, but for the next ones, I don't know how many listeners you have in the U.S., but you just added one.
No.
Well, thank you. You'll hear about the Australian election, which is coming up in 2
Oh,
weeks.
that's cool. Yeah, I'm very interested. Will Morrison be in Tokyo on the 24th?
I'm actually not sure. So our election's on the 21st. So that would be 3 days after. I suppose it would depend on how close the election is. We've had a lot of close elections in the past 10 years, a lot of them. So you never know.
Yeah, I assume it'll be close.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it'll be funny. It'll be funny to launch the Asia Pacific Economic Framework without Australia. Somebody will know. I hope.
I'm sure someone will be sent there. Someone who doesn't need to count numbers.
Andrew, Ella, Luke, pack your bags. Okay, you might be called upon to make a quick trip up to Tokyo.
Well, let's hope so. Thank you, Craig Allen. My name is Andrew Clement, and my co-host is Isabella Anderson. This has been Sunday Sessions with the Macquarie University Liberal Club. We will see you next time. Goodbye.